defines a generation. Music is a soundtrack of revolution. Music is a soundtrack of movement. Music is a soundtrack of cause. There is an intersection of politics and pop culture that you didn't even know existed. There is some boy, some girl sitting in a cubicle along K Street, somewhere in DC. A boy, a girl sitting in a cubicle along a hill with a Capitol with a dome who has single-handedly decided what you wore today. Whoa.
Mike Muse is an industrial engineer, a music executive, a political architect. He breaks down the intersection of politics and pop culture. This is the Mike Muse Show.
Like a cop car. Hey. I make you sing. Throwing the buck in the latest drop. I got stopped by a lady cop.
What's happening, world? It's your boy, Mike Muse. Thank you for joining me back for the Mike Muse Show. We have another exciting episode, and I can't wait just to get into it. Just a little bit of update. I think now I can say welcome back to the award-winning Mike Muse Show. That's right, folks. We got an award for this show. We haven't even been a year in, and we are already getting recognized. And so I just wanted to take the time to thank you, the listeners who tweet me, DM me, send me messages on Instagram, post, comment, shout me out, find my emails, and really say how much you're enjoying this show. Is getting the attention of a lot of people out there in America, and I just cannot be excited, and it just makes me more engaged and more interested to do more, be bigger, be better, be smarter, even be more innovative than we already have been before. So I just want to thank, so use this time right now to thank my team, Andrea Ferguson, James Guerra, oh man, I knew I should have done this. This is what happens when these celebrities get these award shows. They actually don't write things down. They try and go up there and improv with it. Jesus Christ. I'm going to have to do this again in the show and take some notes to shout out my team, man. But literally, thank you guys all so much for all the hard work that you do in putting this in. And so, speaking of innovations, man, we have another cool topic. Over the weekend, the news hit. People started calling me up like, yo, Mike, did you hear about this Lil Wayne scenario? I'm like, yo, what's happening to Lil Wayne? People know that I'm a huge fan of Lil Wayne. And they said that Lil Wayne is finally free of his contract. And now he solely owns his record label. And it's all his, Young Money. And he's free from Cash Money with Birdman. I was like, yo, no way. For you guys that may not know Lil Wayne, he is a prolific rapper, one of the biggest in the game. I've always been a fan of his, but when I knew that he was one of my favorites, there's a song called Mrs. Officer off of one of his projects, and I just thought his ability to flip it and play with words and metaphors was so unique to me, and that's one of the reasons why I think that in hip-hop sometimes is underrated when it comes to English and grammar and ways that we can teach English. And I've always had this dream of maybe going back and being a special adjunct professor at a university in the English department, really breaking down all the metaphors of hip-hop and alliteration of hip-hop, and just how important it is to our culture that is America, and in terms of how it's moved the needle in so many ways and being one of the most consumed genres right now on the streaming sites. And so this is what this episode is about, man, being inspired by Lil Wayne. And I thought it'd be really great to really tie in policy. I thought it'd be great to really tie in activism. I thought it'd be really great to tie in intellectual property and copyright and the Music Modernization Act. And as you guys know, because you have been listening to the show, we kicked off the Mike Muse Show discussing the Music Modernization Act and really helping artists and musicians and producers monetize their sales and their pay on an equal playing field. And I have an all-star panel lined up for you guys going to help me break through this, because I'm not an entertainment attorney, although I pretend because I watch Law and Order way too much. I think I am an attorney at this point, but I thought it'd be wise enough for me to get some experts on it. And so I have three dynamic guests who are joining me right now. The first is by the name of Lita Rosario. Lita Rosario is pretty much the one man. I don't even know which gender pronoun to give it to you, but Lita is just that human being right now on the world and the planet. Really quickly, she is the principal of WYZ Girl Entertainment Consulting and Boutique Entertainment, intellectual property law and consulting firm in Washington, D.C. Once again, I think I blundered that a little bit. She is the principal of WYZ Girl Entertainment Consulting, a boutique entertainment, intellectual property law and consulting firm in Washington, D.C. She served on the Washington, D.C. chapter of Recording Academy, which is the Grammys, Board of governors and serves on the board of directors for the Black Entertainment and Sports Lawyers Association. Lita, I hear you guys have some really great conferences. I haven't been to one yet, but hopefully
we need to get you there.
Yeah, with your connections, I think I might be good. And I really don't read bios this deeply, as you know, listeners on the radio, but there's something really interesting about these next few lines here. It says she's admitted to the state bars in New York, Massachusetts, and District of Columbia, the federal courts bar of the Southern District of New York, the SDNY. We've been hearing a lot about that lately, ladies and gentlemen, regarding to the Mueller investigation. The District Court of District of Columbia and the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, which is usually a stepping stone to the Supreme Court sometimes. So I don't know if we may have a future Supreme Court justice who loves hip-hop. That would be pretty cool, Lita. And most recently, the Supreme Court. And also, too, notably, Lita has been known for Africa Bambaataa and Soulsonic Force and securing their ownership rights back for that song Planet Rock. I just hear Planet Rock and I immediately just start dancing and moving. And also, too, regaining ownership of iconic hit records like Atomic Dog, One Nation Under Groove, basically just everything that makes you feel good. I could go on and on. I'm sure she'll bring up some examples of some of her case that she's done, but help me welcome Lita Rosario to the Mike Muse Show. What's happening, Lita?
Hi, Mike. How are you?
I cannot complain. Did I get everything right in your bio? Because
you did. It's Wise Girl Entertainment. You were right the first time. And yes, you basically got my bio correct. I think you pointed out about the Courts of Appeals, the Second Circuit, which is New York, basically, and the 11th Circuit, which is Georgia, Florida, I think Alabama, some of those southern states. I won an appeal in that court, which is really unusual, on a copyright issue for some of the founders of Casey and the Sunshine Band against Harry Wayne Casey. In terms of collecting royalties. So the Lil Wayne case is really significant, I think, because one of the things that he claimed, I know he claimed a lot of stuff about his artistic expression and not being able to, exercise that. But his other very important claim in that case was related to unpaid royalties, which is a huge problem in the music industry for artists, producers, and songwriters. And I want to kind of get into that a bit as we develop this discussion. But I think it's really, really important because, artistic talents are, really commodities, and they're resources that exist in our communities. And if people can't get the economic benefit of that, it really hurts not only them, it hurts their families, their heirs, but ultimately it hurts our community, and it hurts the artistic community.
It does, which is also, too, why I have the second guest on the line with me to kind of help us, Lita, engage in that conversation. She goes by the name of Kim Tignor. What's happening, Kim? How are you today?
How are you doing?
I cannot complain at all. Ladies and gentlemen, Kim is extremely brilliant and smart and cool and fun and a visionary of all things legal and really advocacy when it comes to arts, entertainment, and media and copyright and intellectual law. She serves currently within the Lawyers Committee, as well as she is one of the co-founders of Creative Control, which is an arts advocacy group to do things that Lita has just previously mentioned. And I thought she's a perfect person to give that perspective of advocacy and what does that mean and why is that important and why is it important to know our rights, as artists and those in the media landscape, and really how does policy and government agencies and the law and the courts help determine that. And so I thought she'd be really cool to have. And so Kim, welcome to the Mike Muse Show.
Oh, thanks for having me, Mike. I have to tell you, in starting Creative Control, it was one of those things. Basically we're a community of legal experts, creatives, policy experts. And, honestly, the folks that are on this phone right now are some of my very trusted and important thought partners in a lot of the work that we do, which is why I'm so excited about this conversation. And I just know that as, you and I talked offline about, Lil Wayne and kind of this story here, right, mm-hmm. which goes back, not just to this past weekend, but this is like a years-long debate, argument, court case. And I just knew from, that we just needed to have a much larger conversation about what's happening to these artists, right?
Yeah.
And, the intellectual property piece is such an interesting piece because, historically, we've just seen artists really taken advantage of, preyed upon, by different industries. And so, the work that we do at Creative Control is really trying to get ahead of that and have folks thinking about these things, from the very beginning, right? Like not even after they're creating and putting something out, but actually training folks to be thinking about this as just, making it hand in hand with their artistry, right? Like even as you create, you need to be thinking about the business side of what you're creating.
That's really true, Kimber, because a lot of times within you're in the creative space and the media space, it's so difficult to break into these genres and into these mediums. And so once you get the opportunity to do it, you're just so excited. You normally just sign away your entire life and you think about the consequences later on, which is why I think it's important to have you on and to really have this conversation, which leads me to my next guest, who I thought was also perfect for the conversation. He goes by the name Mr. Eric Easter. Eric Easter is the CEO of BlackBox Digital, which produces multi-platform documentaries. He's also the chairman of Black Public Media, formerly National Black Programming Consortium, which funds, produces, and distributes nonfiction content for PBS. He's also a founding board member of Full Color Future, which is an organization dedicated to figuring out how to advocate to policymakers in Congress on how to prepare for the next wave of the future of the internet through net neutrality, through economic entrepreneurship, through ventureship, to access to capital, all the things, Kim, that you just teed up so perfectly to really advocate for. And Eric, I thought it was perfect for have you on here because you understand, you come from the consumer side of it in terms of making the money on these different media platforms that uses intellectual property to monetize not only for themselves and their careers, but also too for the mediums that they exist on. So Eric, I just want to welcome to the Mike Muse Show, man.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it.
Glad to have it. Can you talk to us a little bit about what the Black Public Media Group is?
So Black Public Media, again, we changed our name last year, but it's known.
BlackBox Digital, sorry. Mm-hmm.
But I'll do both. So the National Black Programming Consortium is what it used to be called, and then we changed it to Black Public Media. But for the last 40 years, most of what you've seen on PBS created by Black folks has been funded and developed by our organization. Very quietly, we get money from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting to find new producers and directors and people of color who are trying to create TV programs for public media, which of course is funded by our government, and to make sure that creators of color have a voice on the airwaves that are public, that our tax dollars pay for. And so, we actually train a lot of filmmakers on exactly what we're talking about because there are documentaries that we funded years ago that would cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars to see now because people didn't buy the rights or didn't do the right thing when they made them. And Eyes on the Prize is the perfect example. It would cost you a good $200,000 to $250,000 to see that very vital documentary now. Not you as a consumer, but if you were a streaming company or a programmer wanting to show that. So many mistakes were made in the rights getting of that when they were making that it's made it hard to see. So that's one thing we do. BlackBox Digital is my company that simply produces content for all of those platforms as well.
Oh, fantastic. So you raised up a really good point, and Lita, I'm about to come to you right now. Eric, when you talk about how the industry has changed and these mediums have changed due to technology, has allowed the production and producing content much cheaper, and that's why we have so many entrances of individuals able to get into it because the barrier looks different, which is why it's important for us to have organizations like Creative Control really advocating for startups, individuals, so they know what they're getting themselves into. Really, when you look at what's happening with Lil Wayne right now, Lil Wayne really hasn't released an album or a project on these digital streaming services yet. But imagine if he was already one of the top selling hip hop artists prior to really digital streaming becoming a moment. And now with hip hop being the most consumed content on digital streaming, what his potential could be now with his much anticipated Final Carter album that is coming out was even more interesting, Eric. And as I was hearing you think about that, it made me think about, Lita, what's happening now with Spotify and how they have already disrupted the medium and the industry in so many different ways. But eventually they're starting to look at doing exclusive deals with independent artists and really just cutting the labels out altogether, so we could see another transformative moment within the music industry and in the labels in terms of what does the next iteration look like, and then how do record labels have to adjust their business models, because they're always constantly adjusting their business models in order to create revenue streams that we have going on. So that just puts a smack dab into the middle, Lita, with Lil Wayne. Can you just give us a little bit of a context of how we even got to this point where Lil Wayne was in this contractual negotiation where he felt, and he said felt like he was being held prisoner, and why he got out and how he got out. You made, as you citizens, she's not the attorney for the case, just giving her opinion or perspective, but maybe you can tie in some of the other previous cases that you did in terms of how you were able to get them their copyrights back.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting to note on the Lil Wayne situation. It certainly says that he owns the label now, but the news commentary has been a bit silent, and I'm presuming the settlement agreement is confidential as to whether or not he actually owns his masters. So that's an interesting angle on that. So owning your own label doesn't automatically mean that you own your masters. In traditional recording and distribution agreements, the larger label or distributor tries to always own the masters. Mm-hmm. That may not be the case with Lil Wayne because of Cash Money came into a situation where they were one of the early companies who had significant sales independently and went into a situation with Universal, I think it was initially, where they did actually own their masters. It was akin to what's called a press and distribute deal, meaning that the distributor is basically giving them money up front, but they're going to, press and distribute their stuff, but they're not actually owning the master. So just a little bit of unclear right there in terms of what it is that he actually owns. It's great that he got ownership and control of his company, and he doesn't have to go through I guess the Cash Money Group anymore in order to do the things creatively that he wants to do. But as I mentioned initially, I felt the big significant thing in his lawsuit was that he alleged that there hadn't been any payment of royalties. And just from being out in the industry, I know that there are lots of producers and songwriters coming out of that camp who have never received any royalties at all. And, unfortunately, that's the case not only for artists kind of in this more recent iteration of the music business, but also going back historically. We can go all the way back to the 40s and 50s and come forward, and we see the same trend consistently that artists are not getting paid their royalties. And fortunately for Lil Wayne, he got in there and made a stink and filed a lawsuit and took the kind of hit of not being able to put his music out to make the point of his lawsuit and getting the rights that he felt he was entitled to in his lawsuit. A lot of artists are afraid of that because they're afraid that if they have a dispute with a major label or a distributor and they have to get into litigation, that in the interim they're going to lose out because the public is going to forget about them, or their music won't be relevant anymore, or some other artist will come in and take their slot. So there's kind of a lot of pressure on artists to not kind of stop and sue and take account of monies that are owed to them, and that's a consistent problem.
That reminds me, Lita, about the Prince dynamic when he was fighting for his masters, right, during that time period when he had the slave on his cheek, and he was able to get his masters. And so I'm really glad that you brought that distinction in the sense of actually owning your masters versus owning your label,
right.
Which gives you two totally different, not only just revenue streams, but just you actually owning your art, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Outright and rightfully so. Well, in your
Right.
work that you did with African Bambaataa and the work that you did with Casey and the Sunshine Band, as you fought to have their ownership rights back, what what was some of the mechanics, if you will, from a very basic, practical, conversational level that allowed them to get their ownership rights back? And what role does Congress have in that sense of how they set law or precedents in terms of how copyright is handled?
That's a great question. So the Copyright Act of 1976, which was effective as of 1978, has a provision, Section 203 of the Copyright Act, that actually allows artists, creators, authors, and this is beyond the music business. So this is if you write a book and you sign all your rights over to a book publishing company, or you're a fine artist and you sign over distribution rights to your prints to another company. The statute allows you, after 35 years, to send a notice of termination and regain ownership of your copyrights that you have previously given ownership to, or even if you've just given someone an exclusive license, which can also limit your rights if you've given those exclusive, all the various panoply of rights under the Copyright Act to another person. So the Act actually allows you to terminate and to get your rights back. Now, there's some distinction for songwriters versus artists and producers. Typically, songwriters sign contracts that are a transfer of their copyrights but are not what's called a work made for hire. On the other hand, and for them, it's clear, they have a right of termination after 35 years. There's some complicated statutory requirements in terms of notice and how the notice is to be delivered and things like that for you to get your rights back, which is what I did for African Bambaataa and Soul Sonic Force, and also what I did for one of the original founders of Casey and the Sunshine Band. But you have if you exercise your rights correctly, it puts you in a position to gain some leverage. If you don't want to wait the whole 35 years, you can give the notice up to 10 years before the 35-year mark to try to negotiate and get those rights back, especially if you couple that with some type of a lawsuit demanding payment or demanding an accounting or an audit of earnings that have come in. So that's how I was able to kind of do that for them.
Now, what's interesting about that is what we've been hearing a lot lately now is the Music Modernization Act that's coming up that's supposed to address the copyright pre-1972 music versus post-1972. And listeners, I'm sure at this point you recall when Smokey Robinson came to the Hill for the Senate Hearing Committee to really state the music business's case. Now, there is some various opinions within the music business. There's some organizations and music rights groups that are advocating for the Music Modernization Act. In full disclosure and full transparency, there's other entities and organizations that are lobbying against the music modernizations for whatever reason, and SiriusXM is on that side that's arguing against the Music Modernization Act for numerous different reasons, so just for transparency. But there was something that was interesting about this bipartisan effort that we saw on Capitol Hill, where you had Republicans, you had Democrats, for the most part being in agreement that does need to be a change that's occurring. The full vote hasn't happened yet, but there's something to be watched. And then when we look at what's going to happen within the midterms and seeing how does the House and the Senate, does it flip? But it looks like it's going to be a smooth sail for this act to kind of go forward. With that, and Kim, I want to get your thoughts, and Eric, I want to get your thoughts too on this question. Lita, with the passage of MMA, would it have made it easier for you to advocate for your clients, or would it have made it more difficult, or is it separate altogether?
Right. So once again, when we look at the distinction between songwriters and artists and producers, the Music Modernization Act, I think, is setting up a very positive, which will be a third-party royalty collection society that will collect streaming money, which will have the full transparency on the songwriting and music publishing side for songwriters and publishers to see very clearly where their money is coming from. On the recording side, it dealt with the Music Modernization Act as it is now, we don't know yet what what the Senate is going to do, but as it came out of the House, only dealt with giving what's called a digital performance right to pre-72 recordings, which would allow artists who are featured on those recordings to get performance income through Sound Exchange, essentially. Sound Exchange, your viewers or your listeners may know, is an organization, an entity that collects certain performance rights, royalties for featured artists, and for copyright owners as well. And there's been a continuing dispute as to whether or not pre-72 recordings, because they don't have copyright protection due to a glitch in the Copyright Act, were not being paid those royalties. And so the Act will put them inside of there. In terms of the full transparency, it doesn't really do that the same way that it does the MMA for songwriters in terms of how the royalties are collected for artists, and in particular for pre-72 recordings. Yeah. It also doesn't address a termination right for pre-72 recordings.
Got it.
And so there's still room for improvement. There's still room for reform, but I think the Act does go a long way in terms of improving things and ensuring that, a lot of artists who are featured on pre-72 recordings. If I can note real quickly, one of the other problems that isn't addressed is that sampled artists do not get Sound Exchange or don't get digital performance royalties, which is something that really needs to be addressed as well.
That's a really good point about the whole sampling. That's something that we don't really talk about. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish you could see my smile and in my excitement. As you guys know, I'm a geek at heart, and so having this conversation is just really making my day. And the whole fact that we jumped this conversation off by Lil Wayne and me talking about my favorite song is Mrs. Officer, and this is where we are right now. On the other side of this break, I'm going to have Kim, I'm going to have you talk about the advocacy aspect of it for rights in terms in policy, and what can we do just as consumers to be more engaged in the process, and what should we do as a creatives. And then Eric, Lita brought up something really interesting, and she talked about, from the artist, and doesn't just necessarily mean music. I'm curious in your wide range in your career and using different content, particularly within television and producing, as we think about Netflix and other Hulu and streaming sites, how are they going to be impacted and affected by this too as well? So ladies and gentlemen, go get a snack. We're going to come right on back for the Mike Muse Show on Sirius XM Insight Channel 121.
Make your body sway, socialize. Get down. Let your soul lead the way. Shake it now. Go, ladies. This a living dream. Love, life, live. Come play the game. Our world is free. Do what you want for free.
Yeah. A million here, a million there. Sicilian with long hair, with coconut dairy gear, like smoking the thinnest air. I open the Lamborghini, hoping them crackers see me. Like, look at that breezy. He's a beast, he's a dog, he's the motherfucking problem.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Mike Muse Show. I hope you have been listening to the songs and enjoying the music. I hope you're recalling your favorite music right now. And if you do have a favorite Lil Wayne song, man, hit me up on Twitter at I am Mike Muse, M-U-S in Sam E, and let me know what your favorite Lil Wayne song is. If you guys have any requests, also too, hit us up at SiriusXM SXM Insight on Twitter. So when we took the break, I left off with really wanting to switch the conversation right over to Kim and to Eric. And Kim and Lita set us up really well about talking about the distinctions of MMA and pre-1972 and Digital Modernization Act. And so with you and the work that you do with the Lawyers Committee, in particular more so with creative control, is this the things that you're talking about your clients with? And when budding artists and creatives are coming to you for advice, are you talking to them about this? And Kim, you're a political person yourself, meaning you're highly engaged in this political discourse and policy conversations. And how should we be thinking about this in terms of how our Congress and how our elected officials should be thinking about this, and how should we push them even further?
Right. So I will say this. At our events, what we try to do, I think it's definitely what we do, is that we try to have two conversations. One conversation is that we really talk about the legal protections that are available to folks. We do one-on-one free legal sessions with intellectual property attorneys, where we literally have folks in a quiet back room meeting with attorneys and discussing the very specific issues or challenges that they're dealing with. At the same time, we try to have conversations with policy experts, legal experts, about issues that are going to directly impact emerging artists. And, my experience, especially with this time around with the MMA, is that, what is really missing from the table, right, is the collective voice of individual and emerging artists. You hear from, a lot of the other industry players and, basically your usual suspects. But it's just really, and what we're really working on at Creative Control is building a mechanism so that individual artists have a way to demonstrate the strength of their voices as a collective. And so that was what really struck me from this process. As far as, digging in deep, I really do rely on experts like Eric, like Lita, to help us really unpack and understand how it's going to impact the communities that we work with. But we really do want to build out that infrastructure and the muscle memory for these emerging artists to engage and weigh in on these critical conversations.
And what are some of the things that, because you said something really interesting, I would like for you to peel that back a little bit more when you says really protecting as a collective the impact on their communities. Can you dive in a little bit more and let us know what are your concerns and what are you thinking about when you make that type of statement?
Well, I guess what's just so clear, right, is that we just don't have, as communities, as emerging artists, as young entrepreneurs, we just don't have the muscle memory or just the instincts to want to weigh in and make sure that our elected officials know how we feel and where we stand on these different issues. I think a lot of artists are just so wrapped up in the actual process of creating their works. They're not really thinking about how the policy that's taking place on the Hill is going to impact their ability to share and monetize those works. So, for us, what we're really trying to do is just to build in that awareness from the very beginning. And then not only build in that awareness, but then to bring it all together and just show the weight and the power of this collective and these shared voices and opinions.
I love how you said that, and I thought that's what you were thinking, but I didn't want to make sure I put words into your mouth because as I interview artists all the time, particularly within the athletic realm, and with the sports is at the forefront right now of policy discourse and discussion. A lot of them have been hesitant to really weigh in because of they feel like their fans are nonpartisan, and they don't want to disrupt the flow. They don't want to disrupt their personal income and their personal revenue, but we're starting to see more of a shift like that occur. And what's been shocking to me is that, we do see, particularly within hip hop, we hear these narratives voiced within the music, which is really how the nature and the bedrock of hip hop was really founded and established, and to create these narratives of issues that were happening in the community. But when it comes to advocacy outside the song, we really don't see enough of that. And so imagine what it could be, as you said, Kim, when their collective power, their collective bargaining, collective strength actually begins to take, root outside the studio, outside the album, outside the soundtracks, right? And that's where you can really move the needle, because a lot of times people don't feel qualified. And so I'm really glad that what you guys are doing in Creative Control is letting individuals know that you don't have to be qualified to have a voice within politics. You don't have to be qualified to have a voice in this national discourse. And so I appreciate you for that and the work that you guys are doing. Eric, and the work, you said something interesting to start off. I didn't expect for you to say that you have been sued, and you've been sued. So you've kind of been on both sides of the table to both what Kim has been talking about and what Lita has been talking about. But it really is something interesting what Kim said about having the courage and the strength to actually stand up for something. When you felt the need to sue, you don't have to go into details if you don't like, but what was the moment?
No, I can.
Okay, cool. What was the moment when you said, you know what? No, enough. As an artist, as a creative, I want to protect my stuff, and I'm going to sue you, right? That is difficult to do, which Kim and Lita has been mentioning.
Well, it was even more difficult to do because the person on the other side was Michael Jackson.
Oh.
And Quincy Jones on the other side. So, no, it was interesting. I mean, early in my career, I did a book of photographs, and several of the photographs were used without our permission in the Heal the World video by Michael Jackson. And then they asked for permission after it debuted on television. Wow. And we said, well, you can't ask after the fact. You've already used it. I mean, it's a wonderful, and it was weird because it was, such a wonderful mission, such a wonderful message of the song that, we had to hesitate and say, all right, well, how does it look to, sue somebody for using it for something that's talking about peace and love throughout the world. It's like, well, no, this is our stuff, so we need to ask. And we won, and it was a conversation, and it was a check later. I mean, there was no, we didn't actually have to file suit and go around, but it had to be a funky phone call and a threat of a suit to get it done. And another time, the thing that people don't realize, and, for a lot of folks listening, is that, anytime you use someone's work in any way, shape, or form, particularly in the film business and TV, if you see a scene and there's a book on the table, there's a poster on the wall, there's, music playing behind it, somebody has to clear all of those things. You use someone else's images, you have to get the rights to use it. And when you don't, a lot of those shows, your favorite TV shows, are being sued all the time, or at least getting really bad phone calls from folks saying, hey, why is my picture on the wall? Why is my book on the table? You didn't clear it with me. How are we going to compensate? And, against Quincy Jones, it was one of the TV shows we produced, and, our poster from the book was on the wall. And, we just said, hey, you guys use it without permission. And their trade for it was, well, we'll mention the book in a couple of scripts later. We'll have someone go up and ask for the book in the show, and you'll get free publicity. And, it worked out. Nobody was mad about it. It was a great idea, and it got us some publicity and sold us some more books, so it was fun. Mm-hmm. So it's not always, a Wayne, Little Wayne sort of situation with lawsuits and years and all that. Most times, I would say it's probably amicably resolved. But, with the Music Modernization Act, one of the issues you have is music rights for films and television and other uses, and whether this changes the dynamic. I think, and I don't think it's a bad thing. I think that people should get the full rights, for their work. On the opposite end, it means that, our filmmakers will make different choices. I have to make other choices if the price goes up for music, or they'll make choices to do original music.
Right.
You see a lot. I heard something the other day, and I recognized the bass line in a TV show, and realized it was a bass line from GarageBand.
Oh, wow.
So directors sitting around creating their own music from, of all things, GarageBand, from the 60 choices or something that he has on GarageBand, because he didn't want to pay for music. I was at a meeting at Howard University the other day with the TV station, and, they were complaining that the school wanted the TV station to broadcast a lot of the school's events, but a lot of those events, have the choir singing music or something else using music, or the marching band. But the TV station doesn't have the money to pay for the music rights of those things. So, the rights were bought for the performance at the event. They weren't secured for TV broadcast, so they make a decision not to show the program at all. So, small decisions like that are made every day based on who has the rights, who gets the rights, how much it costs, who's going to get paid. And unfortunately, a lot of folks will use people's work without compensation.
Right.
And that's when you get into these issues.
Eric, I want to make sure that point doesn't get lost, but you started off, and my mouth kind of just opened up when you mentioned that, you were suing Quincy Jones and Michael Jackson, and how you stood your ground, right, and said, no, this is our work. It's on the wall. You're showing it. We want to get paid for that. And I think that's just a lesson, listeners, as you're out there, to always make sure you stand your ground. And I think we're getting so many lessons of that. Eric, with this example that you just gave, and also with Serena Williams, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but there was just something I found very powerful when she stopped the match and she went to go talk to the umpire, and then she asked for the referee while the whole world was watching, because she wanted to stand her ground. Whether or not, and listeners, you believe that's right or wrong, I'm not here to debate that today, but there's just something about stopping and saying, wait, this is impacting me, my work, my quality. And so, Eric, cheers to you for wanting to stand up for that. As we go, though, as we continue the conversation, Eric, I want to talk to you a little bit, because you mentioned a few things about, the payment that needs to be paid for when you have your songs in these shows. And you talked about the TV studio at Howard University and how there has to be some type of payment with that. Who governs that, right? Is it lawyers like Lita who set the tone for that? Is there a government agency and Congress that helps to regulate that? Like, who is the governing agency that determines these type of dynamics? Or is it just law precedent?
It's really just law and doing the right thing for the most part, and it really means it really requires someone in the organization to do the right thing at all times. And this is the thing that you have to talk to young artists about, especially is what decisions do you make, because today's culture is so much about remixing and the sort of free use of other people's works to create a new work, and that's one of those strong conversations you have to have about to young artists is what constitutes a new work when you're using other folks' work, and at some point you have to it's sort of the heart and the spirit of the person doing it that says, well, wait, I've used a bit too much, or this isn't right. I've got to then make this next step. So the law is there, and it's all about whether you have the strength to say, all right, at this point, people need to get paid. I'm going to be fair about this. Or whether you're going to try to skirt the rules, or whether you're just going to say, all right, I need to create original work because I just don't have the budget to compensate people fairly, so I need to do this myself.
Yeah, if I could jump in
Please,
real quick.
Lita,
So it's the copyright statute and the infringement remedies that allow a private party to sue for copyright infringement, which is basically the nature of the lawsuit. Sometimes there are also privacy suits for if someone's in a photograph and they feel like the photograph was used without their consent. It's more of a privacy case, which is state law precedent. Depends on what state you're in as to what your rights are. But for copyright infringement, it's the Federal Copyright Act that defines that. And very importantly, if you haven't registered a copyright, you can't file the copyright infringement suit. So it's really important to file copyrights for new creators to understand that, and also to understand how important it is to get licenses and clearances for other people's work that you use within your work. I've seen numerous independent filmmakers make films and put music in the soundtrack that they didn't in the actual soundtrack of the film, not a separate CD soundtrack or a separate album, and then they can't do anything with their film because they can't get rights to clear. They can't get permission to clear the music. And it's also important to know, as in Eric's situation, it's much better if you ask for permission before you publicize the work. It doesn't matter if you publicize it for profit or not. If you're putting it up on the internet, if you're making a publication of the work and then you try to come back and ask for a clearance, you're always at a disadvantage. So it's always best to seek those clearances out on the front end. And there are companies that are like kind of paralegal companies that do clearances that you can use. You can search for them on the internet for sample clearances and other rights clearances that don't charge as much as lawyers, but can be very helpful to creators in terms of getting clearances for their works. Mm-hmm. As an interesting aside, there was a big problem with the Soul Train TV shows because Don Cornelius hadn't properly acquired licenses for all that music over all those years that was on those TV shows.
Wow.
And that was one of the reasons why he had a problem selling the TV shows off in the end. And, we all know what happened to him. I'm not saying that's the reason why it happened, but I know that it certainly complicated his ability to sell those rights because he had to sell it at a significant discount because he hadn't cleared the music. At the time, the labels were happy to let him use the music because it was promotion for them. But in terms of, going forward, it was a big problem for him when he wanted to actually sell off the rights and get some money for it.
You three are so dope. I feel like I can talk to you for hours and hours, and this, as my listeners know, I never know where the conversation is going to lead me. I always have this idea in mind. I have a framework, but I never know where it's going to go, and you guys have taken this conversation so many fascinating places and spaces. I'm actually learning myself, and I think it's really great when the host can learn with the audience, and I just want to thank you for sharing all this knowledge here. But this leads me to my next point that I want to ask, and this kind of just it's part of my curiosity. This is part of my ignorance, and this is part of me wanting to know. And Kim, this is kind of being inspired by your commentary about the collective bargaining and making sure that as an artist, as a collective, understand that power and what could be, right? And so I guess the question I want to ask the three of you, feel free, whoever feels more comfortable in jumping in on this, is how should we translate that energy towards And what I mean by that is, and I could be wrong, but I am aware there are some parts of the pre-1972 acts and the Copyright Acts that put some control within states. And then what we're learning just in the political discourse is how powerful now our state attorney generals are. And I got to be honest with you guys and to my audience is that, I'm very politically aware, very politically astute, and I really never realized how powerful our state attorney generals are until this recent last year or two when we've seen so many filings against the Trump administration, right, in terms of and blocking a lot of his policies and executive orders. And I'm not here to debate if that's right or wrong or any deference to it, but it's just I'm seeing the breadth of state attorney generals unfold in front of us. Is this a point where some of these things, Kim, that as artists, or creatives, we can be advocating to our state attorney generals in order to make sure things are done better and proper in our states to kind of help protect the creatives? Because there is this daunting notion of if I'm an independent artist or, I'm just getting on the Billboard charts, like, can I go to Congress myself and testify on the Hill, or, can I go to my state attorney general? Is there anywhere we can go as artists and creatives to really begin to advocate for these policies on the state level?
So, interestingly enough, right, there's lots of creatives, there's lots of YouTubers, different folks have already been, present and engaging on the Hill, giving briefings to staffers. We're in a space where there's just a lot of learning to be done, right? But I did want to back up and add one more piece to what we were saying, and this goes to your question, Mike, of what people can do. I think one is to just get the muscle memory and just get into the habit of just fighting back and ensuring and just really, really, really making it a point to have their voices heard. Mm-hmm. And one thing that I wanted to kind of shine a light on also is that as people are putting things up on the internet, I do think I completely agree with Eric and Lita's point about making sure that these things are cleared and that you're giving people the credit that they deserve. But there's also the other side of it, right, of, being able to fall under those fair use exceptions and being able to do mashups and things like that I don't think people are aware of. And one example that I wanted to speak to is, even one of our colleagues recently put up this fantastic review on Childish Gambino's This Is America. And essentially, and it was fantastic. It was insightful. It was thought-provoking. He had, samples of the actual video in his video, but it ended up being taken down, right? YouTube had it taken down within 24 hours. And it was just a really important conversation. And when I asked, I was like, I think that you should appeal this, right? That this is something that falls under those exceptions. But instinctively, in his mind, he's like, I just don't even want to bother. They're probably right, and I don't need to engage. And so it's also that way, too, of being like, no, you have a right, and you should be trying to push this to say, actually, I'm allowed to put this out there. So it kind of cuts both ways.
Yeah, and that's the fair use and transformative use exceptions to defenses to copyright infringement, which are really very, very important. I agree with Kim on that we have to also put those things into context. So, and it's important for creators to know how fair use works and how transformative use works. And also there's a defense of de minimis use where the use is so small. Madonna recently won a case on de minimis use, and Drake won a case as well. Oh, wow. So it's important to understand all of that. Unfortunately, it can be very costly to get involved in those kinds of lawsuits. And one of the other issues is that the Copyright Act has a provision in it that allows the prevailing party in a lawsuit to recover attorney's fees. Mm-hmm. And that actually can be have a chilling effect on a lot of creators who want to kind of challenge, especially the major labels' rights to use their works, or for them to challenge a major label who's saying you can't use this work, or a major publishing company. And unfortunately, the big companies use that attorney's fees provision as a sword. And I've actually been in many situations where they've come after my client saying, we're going to sue you we're going to recover $1 million in attorney's fees if you try to bring this case. So there are a lot of issues there. I think that's a place for reform in the Copyright Act as well, to kind of limit how the attorney's fees provision can be used as a sword that actually prevents creativity rather than encourages it.
Well, those are two solutions I'm hearing right now, and I love to be solution. As my listeners know, I love to be solution oriented, and so one, maybe we should start advocating, and with the help of Creative Control and Kim, for that provision to be in there for attorney fees, and then the next solution too is Kim, what you're saying is to just push back, and I don't want to force something that it just isn't there. But is there something there with our state attorney generals? Is there a way for us to get them involved in this?
All right, that's a great question. And actually, when Elliot Spitzer was the Attorney General for the state of New York, he actually had the major labels and music publishers enter into a consent decree over their failure to pay artists royalties. And it's a significant consent decree. Unfortunately, it really isn't being enforced now by the current Attorney General's office. And there do need to be complaints put in to the Attorney General's office in New York. I believe California has a similar consent decree with the major labels because they have this historic problem of actually paying artists royalties. And basically the consent decree said, look, if you owe royalties to an artist and you haven't paid it, or you claim you can't find them, then you have to turn that money over to the state as unclaimed property. You, major record label or major music publisher or major book publisher, you don't have the right to keep that money because it's not your money.
Wow. Maybe then we can take that money and create a fund that will help cover some of these legal fees for people to push back on their creative rights.
Yeah.
I think that's the third solution, guys.
Yeah.
Kim, get on that on behalf of Creative Control and advocate for that for all of us, I believe.
We should say that with Lil Wayne, I mean, that happened actually a little earlier this year. I mean, prior to this last decision, the court found that he got a great settlement on his royalties as well. So that happened prior to him getting ownership of his label. So he's been fighting, battles on several levels.
That's amazing.
But, the other solution is also education at a much younger level, because kids are, the advent of technology lets people get into the business in many different ways at a much earlier age and go direct to the consumer without having to go through the normal channels. And so they tend to miss some of the control, and I wouldn't say controls, but some of the folks who would normally give advice. They don't have to go through those folks as well. So people are finding themselves out there without the necessary support to protect their work. And so it really is important that in arts education at the middle school, high school level really begin to include things on contracts and IP and copyright. And surprisingly, it isn't even at the most well-known arts schools and arts high schools. You don't get contractual. You may get a class. You may get a speaker coming in and talking about it. It's not a regular part of the course. Right. So people are making the same mistakes year in and year out. And you love somebody like Lil Wayne or any of the folks who in the last Robin Thicke, folks who've had court cases. You don't want them to, you don't think it's great that they've been sued, but these kinds of things give you a way to talk about it with people who they know, and so it opens up the discussion in ways that you couldn't if it was just sort of a flat conversation about copyright, so they can relate to it a little bit more, but still people continue to make the same mistakes.
Well, Kim, you have your work cut out for you. You have to take all these solutions on behalf of Creative Control and do everything with it. Kim,
Lita and Eric will be hearing from me.
Kim, how can more people find out about Creative Control and engage with you on social media? Do you have a hashtag? Do you have a Twitter handle, Instagram handle?
Yes, you can find us at Creative Control on Instagram and Twitter, and we're at www.creativecontrol.org.
Awesome. And Lita, how can people reach you if they want more information? Is there emails or websites or a Twitter handle?
Sure, they can go to they can send emails to information, spelled out, information at wyzgirl.com, or they can call me at 202-628 1092.
Awesome. And Eric, what about you, my friend?
blackpublicmedia.org.
All right, awesome. You guys have been a fantastic panel. Thank you so much for joining the Mike Muse Show. Listeners, as always, you can reach me at I am Mike Muse, MUSNSAME, on Twitter and on Instagram, and also, too, on the Insight channel, SXM Insight. All right, I know I messed up at the beginning of the show, giving my thank yous to all those who've helped make the Mike Muse Show an award-winning show. And so I want to make sure I get everyone's names right and get it out in one shot. Just want to thank the team, Roy Belfi, Christine Wellen, James Maresca, Kevin Beckford, Andrea Ferguson Peterson, Stephanie Reed, Cal Whitaker, Sam Helm, Matt Walt, Everett Harrison, my big brother Sway, my homegirl Heather B. Thank you so much. As always, ladies and gentlemen, until next week, we are out.
Straight off the block with it. Eagle Street to be specific. I'm peeping at you, people different. I pay my dues, you keep the difference. I can see the end in the beginning.